Senara Hulst was found posed like a sculpture in the snow. Emelyn Dross escaped with her life, but not her mind. And Naira Wend came within inches of becoming the final masterpiece. These were not random victims. They were chosen, studied, and carved into a horrific narrative by a man who called his killings art. What investigators uncovered in the frozen woods of Windmere Falls was so disturbing, so meticulously orchestrated, that even the most hardened detectives broke down at the crime scenes. This is the case that left scars on everyone who touched it, a case so brutal it traumatized police forever. The town of Windmere Falls lay nestled between quiet hills and frozen rivers, a place so still in winter it felt untouched by time. In late November 2023, the snow came early, blanketing the trees and roads in silence. It was during this eerie calm that the horror began. On a frosted morning, a hiker named Colby Wren, following a barely visible trail through the dense pine woods east of the town, stumbled upon what he thought was an animal carcass tangled in dead leaves. He leaned closer and froze. It wasn't an animal. The figure on the ground was human, twisted unnaturally, with frost clinging to every inch of exposed flesh. Authorities were called immediately. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. Yellow tape flickered in the wind, while officers stood with pale faces, clearly shaken. Detective Marlo Veyne, a 49-year-old investigator known for his calm demeanor and nearly 2 decades of homicide work, was called to the scene. He'd seen his share of cruelty, from domestic killings to calculated gang executions. But something about the corpse beneath the snow made his chest tighten. The victim, partially buried, was missing both hands. Her face was swollen, mutilated beyond recognition. Most haunting were the strange marks on her legs and stomach, shallow carvings in the shape of circles and arrows, as if someone had been drawing on her skin. The forensic team carefully removed the body, taking photos and samples. It was determined the woman had been dead for at least 10 days. Her body was frozen stiff, but decomposition had begun beneath the surface. The condition of the remains told a grim story. This wasn't a simple murder. This was prolonged. This was cruel. The location where she was found, deep in the woods, suggested someone had gone to great lengths to hide her, but not completely. It was almost like she had been placed there to be found. Back at the Windmere Falls Police Department, fingerprints were taken and a full autopsy was ordered. The results confirmed the worst suspicions. The woman had been tied up, tortured over several days, then strangled. Her hands had been removed post-mortem, possibly as a trophy or to delay identification. But there was one clue the killer didn't remove: a partial tattoo, half visible under the collarbone. It was faded but unique, an abstract pattern of feathers and flames. Detectives ran it through missing persons files. Within hours, they had a match. The victim was Senara Hulst, a 26-year-old artist who had been reported missing 2 weeks prior by her landlord after she failed to pay rent or answer her phone. Senara had lived alone in a small studio apartment above a bakery. She was known in town as quiet and talented, mostly keeping to herself. Her artwork often featured surreal, dreamlike imagery. Faces hidden in flowers, bodies morphing into birds. She had no known enemies, no history of drug use, and no boyfriend on record. Her disappearance had barely made headlines. Now, she was the centre of the most disturbing case Windermere Falls had ever seen. Detective Veyne visited the apartment, hoping to find answers. The space was neat, but sterile, almost as if someone had already gone through it. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her sketchbooks were stacked neatly, brushes washed and left to dry. But in the bottom drawer of her desk, under a pile of blank canvases, was something odd. A sketch, rough and hastily drawn. It depicted a face, elongated and twisted, with hollow eyes and a stitched mouth. Beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, was a name, VL. No one in town knew a person with those initials. Her phone records were pulled, and her social media accounts combed through. A pattern began to emerge. Over the past few months, Senara had received anonymous messages, praising her art, but growing darker and more obsessive over time. One message read, "Your hands create beauty. One day they will be mine." The puzzle pieces were grim, and the message was clear. Someone had been watching Senara, studying her, waiting. The realization chilled Detective Veyne more than the snow ever could. The killer wasn't finished. He had made his move, and he had left just enough behind to prove it was only the beginning. The focus of the investigation quickly turned to the studio Senara Hulst had rented on Rookridge Lane. Tucked between an abandoned bookstore and an old watch repair shop, the place barely stood out, just another forgotten corner of Windermere Falls. The windows were dust-streaked and the door was bolted shut, but the lease was still active. The building's owner, a retired man named Ellis Fendrake, confirmed Senara had rented the space 6 months ago under her real name. She claimed it was for painting in peace, away from distractions. She paid cash, always on time, and rarely interacted with anyone. Detective Marlo Veyne entered the studio alongside a forensic team. The interior felt cold, untouched. A single wooden easel stood by the far wall. Beside it a small table with dried brushes and unopened tubes of paint. At first glance, the room seemed innocent, until they noticed the heavy trapdoor in the floor, half hidden beneath a frayed rug. It creaked open with resistance, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air changed the moment they stepped below. Damp and silent, the basement smelled faintly of chemicals and decay. The walls were unfinished concrete, and the space had no windows. A flickering bulb revealed what had been hidden. Against the far wall was an old chest, locked but brittle with age. When pried open, it revealed a disturbing collection. Nearly 3 dozen hand-drawn sketches, all signed with the same 2 letters, VL. These weren't like Senara's usual work. They were violent, grotesque, filled with imagery of bound women, twisted limbs, and exaggerated expressions of agony. In several drawings, a faceless man appeared in the background, his silhouette haunting, his hands always reaching toward the victims. Detective Veyne felt a shift in his understanding. Senara hadn't just been targeted. She had known someone, was watching her. Maybe even someone she had met. Someone who had fed off her art and twisted it into something horrific. They began tracing the initials VL, starting with the town's historical records and business licenses. There were no local residents or employees registered under those initials. But when Veyne expanded the search to include property leases, he found something. 3 years earlier, a small warehouse had been rented under the name Venrik Lorne. The building, located on the edge of town near the old rail yard, had been used for storage. The lease was short-term, and no one had seen or spoken to the renter in person. The payment came by wire transfer from a now closed account, with no forwarding information, but the name stuck. A background check revealed Venrik Lorne had once been a taxidermy apprentice in a nearby city, but had left the trade following several complaints from clients about disturbing practices. No charges had been filed, but Venrik had vanished soon after. Now they had a name, but no face. No recent photos existed, and no known address. The trail was faint. Veyne pushed forward, ordering a deeper search into Venrik's history, contacts, and purchases. A break came when a local hardware store reported a man matching an older photo of Venrik had purchased surgical gloves, wire, and industrial plastic sheets months earlier. He had used cash and given no name, but the cashier remembered him because of his strange demeanour. Quiet, but with a cold, fixed stare. Armed with this clue, police searched nearby rental properties and remote residences. Their efforts brought them to a crumbling Victorian house near the forest line. No neighbours, no utilities, but a mailbox still bearing the name Lorne. Inside, they found a place that could only be described as chilling. The living room was nearly empty, save for rows of taxidermy animals, each carefully arranged in unnatural poses. But the true horror lay in the back room. In jars on shelves were what at first seemed like fake props, until the forensic team confirmed they were real human teeth. Dozens of them. More photographs were pinned to the wall. Women posed like mannequins, their eyes vacant. In one image, taken with an old film camera, the woman was unmistakably Senara. The photograph had been dated 3 days before her disappearance. Among the items collected was a leather-bound book containing dozens of notes, diagrams and poems, each written in a slow, methodical hand. The last entry read, "The hands that paint must be preserved. She is perfect now, but the next will be more beautiful still." Venrik Lorne had vanished, but he had left behind a trail that whispered of obsession, violence, and something more, chilling, intent. The studio had been a trap, and Senara had unknowingly walked into the hands of a man who didn't just want to kill. He wanted to create. 12 days after the discovery of Senara Hulst's body, a call came in to the Windmere Falls Sheriff's Office from a truck driver travelling along Route 41, a desolate stretch of road cutting through the frozen wilderness near Lake Trennan. The driver reported seeing a disoriented woman stumbling along the shoulder, barefoot and barely dressed, her skin scraped raw and her hair matted with dirt. Officers arrived within 15 minutes and found her collapsed in the snow, trembling and half-conscious, her lips cracked from cold and dehydration. She kept repeating the same word under her breath, Venrik. The woman was rushed to Windmere General Hospital, where staff began treatment for hypothermia, dehydration, and multiple surface wounds. It wasn't until nearly 8 hours later that she was able to speak clearly. Her name was Emelyn Dross. She had been reported missing 3 months earlier from the town of Gracefield, 2 hours away. Emelyn had been assumed dead. Another face among the many cold cases that quietly collected dust. But now she was the only known survivor of Venrik Lorne. Her account stunned everyone. Emelyn described waking up in a dark, concrete room after accepting a ride from a man on the outskirts of her town. She never saw his face clearly, only his eyes. Cold, unblinking, almost empty. Over the following weeks, she had been chained to a pipe, fed minimal food, and subjected to psychological torment. The man never spoke to her. Instead, he watched. He would sometimes draw her, sometimes photograph her, and other times simply sit in silence as she cried. The most disturbing detail was the routine. Every morning, he would place a mirror in front of her and carve small shapes into her skin, as if etching a story that only he could understand. She remembered seeing other women, at least 2, in separate rooms down a hallway. One of them, she believed, was already dead. The other she never saw again. Emelyn had managed to escape when a rusted hook from a pipe above her came loose. She used it to pry the lock on her ankle chain. It took her 3 days to break through a boarded-up window. She ran through the forest with no idea where she was, eventually reaching the highway by chance. Her details gave investigators a significant breakthrough. Based on her descriptions, the mouldy smell, the cold air, the faint sound of running water, they believed the location was somewhere near the eastern woods of Lake Trennan. A search team was formed, combing the forest with cadaver dogs and thermal imaging drones. After 2 days, they located a structure hidden beneath thick brush and fallen trees. An old cabin built partially into a hillside, camouflaged by nature and time. The front door was chained shut from the outside. When the team broke in, what they found was worse than anything previously seen in the case. The interior had no furniture except for makeshift beds made of old blankets and straw. The walls were covered in plastic sheeting, and dried blood stained the wooden floor. In one corner, a small camera had been rigged to a crude tripod, with a drawer of film reels beside it. In the main room, police discovered a notebook, water-damaged but mostly legible. It detailed a list of names, most crossed out. Emelyn's name was at the bottom. Beneath it, another name had just been written in fresh ink. Naira Wend. 2 rooms down the narrow hallway matched Emelyn's account exactly. One was empty. The other contained decomposing remains, later confirmed through dental records to belong to one of the other missing women from a nearby town. In the final room, painted entirely in black, was a disturbing shrine, photographs of Senara and other victims arranged around a single burning candle. The photos were marked with hand-drawn lines and symbols, some matching the carvings found on Senara's body. Though Emelyn had escaped, it was clear Venrik had left in a hurry. Food cans were open, the candle had only recently been lit, and boot prints led from the back exit into the woods. He had been there just hours before. The survivor's account did more than confirm Venrik's involvement. It proved the extent of his crimes and that he had no intention of stopping. With a new name in his journal, the race was on. The hunt had entered its most critical phase, and no one knew where the predator might strike next. The name Naira Wend became the focus of every investigative effort. Her profile fit Venrik's disturbing pattern. She was 25, an illustrator known for surreal black-and-white drawings, often shared on obscure online art forums. She lived alone in a converted loft near the industrial outskirts of Darwin Hollow, about 30 miles from Windmere Falls. Police contacted her immediately, but there was no answer on her phone, and neighbours hadn't seen her in days. Fearing the worst, a team was dispatched to her apartment. The front door was locked, but there were no signs of forced entry. When officers broke it open, the space inside appeared almost too perfect. Dishes were cleaned and stacked. A teacup rested on the table, and her drawing supplies were arranged precisely by size. But the calm quickly gave way to unease. In the centre of the loft, taped to the floor, was a circle with dozens of tiny symbols etched around its edges. At the centre sat a single Polaroid photo. Naira, sitting on a bench, smiling at the camera. A date was scrawled on the back, just 4 days earlier. Her laptop, still powered on, revealed even more disturbing content. A draft email sat unsent, addressed to an anonymous user. I received the parcel. No return address. Inside was a feather, a burned-out match, and a strip of film. It felt like a warning. I don't know what this means. Should I call someone? The email was never sent. Forensic teams uncovered a hidden folder on her hard drive, labelled Watcher. Inside were dozens of screenshots. Naira had apparently been tracking her own stalker. She had noticed a man appearing repeatedly in the background of public spaces, grocery stores, bus stops, art galleries. His face was always partially hidden, but it matched the grainy photograph of Venrik Lorne taken years ago. The last screenshot was a reflection from her apartment window. A man standing across the street in the rain, staring up at her floor. It became clear to the investigators that Naira knew something was wrong and had been documenting it silently, afraid that no one would believe her. There were no fingerprints in the apartment other than hers. But under her bed, they found a matchbook from a roadside diner nearly 70 miles north, in a forgotten township called Bramble Pike. The matchbook was smeared with charcoal, a type of smudge commonly used in her sketches, and dated only a week prior. It was a slim lead, but it was all they had. Detective Marlo Veyne and his team travelled to Bramble Pike immediately. The town was nearly abandoned, a remnant of a collapsed logging industry. The diner was still open, barely, operated by an elderly couple who remembered a young woman coming in recently, asking about cabins for rent. She had seemed nervous but polite. She didn't give a name, but she paid in cash and left behind a small sketchbook, forgotten on a booth seat. The owner kept it, assuming she'd return. The drawings inside matched Naira's style. Trees with faces, abandoned buildings, and most unsettling, a man's silhouette repeated across pages, always drawn without a face, only empty space where his features should be. In the back cover, scribbled hastily in pencil, was an address: Old Crane Mill, West Path. Police searched the area and located the old mill. Its roof partially caved in and graffiti covering its stone walls. Inside, it was empty, but the dust on the floor revealed fresh footprints leading to a side room. In there, they found another Polaroid of Naira, this time bound and gagged, with a single word written across the bottom in red ink: Muse. A fresh cigarette butt on the floor and a still warm coffee thermos confirmed they had just missed Venrik again. He was moving, constantly, always one step ahead. But he was also slipping, leaving behind traces, making emotional decisions. The photograph proved she was still alive, but for how long was unknown. Detective Veyne stood in the centre of the mill, realizing the full weight of the case. Venrik Lorne wasn't just abducting women. He was building something. A story. A collection. Each victim was chosen, stalked, broken, and displayed like a piece in a private gallery. The only question now was whether Naira could be saved before she became the final exhibit. The search for Naira Wend entered its final phase as snow blanketed the countryside, obscuring roads and slowing efforts. Venrik Lorne had become a ghost, a figure that drifted between shadows, always watching, always aware. Yet his confidence had become his weakness. Every location he touched left behind a breadcrumb, not obvious at first, but consistent in pattern. Detective Marlo Veyne knew they had to change tactics. Venrik was not just hiding, he was performing, curating each scene like a twisted narrative. And Naira wasn't just a victim. She was his final act. Veyne and his team consulted Emelyn Dross, again, the only known survivor. She remembered a sound that stood out, a low rhythmic rumble that echoed every night through the concrete walls of her cell. It was not a natural noise. It resembled machinery, perhaps industrial, combined with the scent of oil and the moisture in the air. It suggested a location near water or a large mechanical operation. Cross-referencing old industrial sites near Bramble Pike and Darwin Hollow led the team to an abandoned hydroelectric station deep in the forest near the Wraithstone River. It had been decommissioned 2 decades earlier after a structural failure. Now it sat unused, unreachable by car due to collapsed access bridges. The team approached on foot, moving through thick snow and dead brush. The structure loomed ahead like a monument to forgotten industry, its turbine room partially intact, surrounded by broken fencing and rusted machinery. Inside, it was colder than the air outside. Graffiti covered most walls, but some were scrubbed clean, painted over with charcoal black patches. As the team moved deeper into the station, they found what they feared most: a crude wooden door reinforced with steel bars. It was locked from the outside. Breaking it open, they were hit with a wave of stale air and the overwhelming stench of rot. The room beyond was small, windowless, and lit only by a dying lantern. Naira Wend lay in the corner, wrists bound but conscious. Her eyes widened at the sight of light, her mouth too dry to scream. She had been kept alive, barely, and her body bore the same carvings as Senara's, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had been practicing restraint. Medical personnel rushed her out, and Veyne scanned the room, searching for signs of Venrik. A trapdoor behind a shelf led to a hidden crawl space. Inside, a bedroll, several sketchbooks, and a recording device were found. The device contained hours of audio, soft humming, scratching pens, footsteps, and finally, Venrik's voice reading passages from his journal aloud. One entry stood out. "She is not the last, but she is the purest. I see it now. This world cannot understand creation. It only destroys. But in these walls, I preserve beauty. I silence the chaos." His voice was calm, almost soothing. He believed what he was. Doing was art, but his escape was not flawless. A surveillance drone had been deployed earlier in the day, circling above the station. On reviewing the footage, officers caught a glimpse of Venrik exiting through a rear hatch, disappearing into the tree line. He had been there the entire time, watching. The manhunt expanded immediately. Drones, canine units, and helicopters swept the woods. They found a trail, a small shelter recently used with blood-stained gauze and a torn coat. It was clear he had been wounded, likely during his escape. For the next 48 hours, the woods became a war zone of silent tension. Then, less than 2 miles from the river, a hiker reported a strange smell near an old hunting cabin. Inside, officers discovered Venrik's body. He had slit his wrists and arranged his body on the floor in a crucifix pose, surrounded by photos of his victims. On the wall above him, written in his own blood, were the words, "Now they can't fade." The case closed with the kind of finality that brought no comfort. Naira Wend survived, but would never fully escape the images branded into her mind. Detective Veyne left the force 6 months later, his sleep haunted by the faces he couldn't save. The story of Venrik Lorne became legend in Windmere Falls. A case so brutal, it didn't just shock a town. It shattered the men and women sworn to protect it. And in some quiet corners, where the light doesn't quite reach, his art still whispers from the shadows.